The sound of the waves crashing on the shore was the only thing that kept Charlie grounded as he sat by the ocean. The night was calm, and the cool breeze brushed against his skin, but his thoughts were a whirlwind. The vastness of the sea seemed to reflect his own internal conflict, endless, deep, and filled with unknowns. "Those were the days when I was the kind of person who had no worth," Charlie whispered to himself. His voice broke the silence of the night, and he stared out into the dark horizon, where the sea and sky met in an endless embrace. This same existence, which now makes people admire me, was once the reason for their contempt. He paused for a moment, trying to push away the memories that had haunted him for so long. 4 years ago he had been someone completely different. He had been nothing but an outcast, a boy whose existence didn't matter to anyone. The color of his skin had defined his worth in the eyes of society, a Negro, someone who was less than human. But now things had changed. Charlie had fought hard to change his life, to prove to himself and to others that he was more than the labels that had been placed upon him. Yet, deep down, he could never shake off the pain of his past. "Now, I'm the same Charlie I was 4 years ago, but the way people see me has changed so much," he murmured, the waves crashing louder as if to echo his words. He couldn't help but wonder, had he really changed? Or was it the world around him that had shifted, accepting him for who he was, finally? Was it him or just the perception of him that had been transformed? Charlie remembered the days when he had been nothing. His skin, his features, everything had been a reason for people to point, to mock, to laugh. He had been a target for every insult, a punching bag for those who believed they were superior. His childhood had been filled with rejection, his innocence stolen by the harsh realities of the world around him. As a young boy, Charlie had never understood why he was treated differently. He had no clue about the cruelty of the world, the hate that existed simply because of the color of his skin. He had only known that he was different, that he didn't fit in, that his presence made others uncomfortable. He had spent countless hours in front of the mirror, wondering what was wrong with him. His own reflection seemed foreign to him at times, like a constant reminder of the injustice of the world. He clenched his fists, the memory of the hurtful words people had spoken to him still fresh. "You're not worth our time," they would say. "Go back to where you came from." The words stung even now, after all these years. His mind often replayed those moments of rejection, moments where he had felt worthless, invisible. But tonight, something felt different. As he sat on the shore, the wind carrying his thoughts into the night sky, Charlie realized that he had fought his way out of that darkness. He had worked tirelessly to change his own fate, to stop being the boy who was pitied. He had broken free from the chains of society's prejudice, but it hadn't been easy. "I've come so far, but I'm still not enough for some," Charlie muttered, his eyes fixed on the stars above. He had worked hard to earn respect, to be seen as something more than the stereotype that had been forced upon him. He had made a life for himself, built it from the ground up. Yet, no matter how much he had achieved, there were still those who saw him as nothing more than the boy from the past. He thought of his family, of how they had supported him throughout this journey. They had always believed in him, even when he couldn't believe in himself. They had been there when the world had turned its back on him, when his dreams seemed impossible. And now, Charlie had a chance to give them something better, something they had never thought possible. "But it's not just for them," he whispered into the night. "It's for me too. I'm doing this for me, to prove that I matter, to prove that my existence is worth something." As the night deepened and the stars twinkled above, Charlie felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. He was no longer just the boy who was rejected, no longer just the Negro who was pushed aside. He was Charlie, a man who had found his voice, who had carved his own path in a world that had once told him he didn't belong. He stood up and walked closer to the water's edge, feeling the cold waves kiss his feet. The moonlight reflected off the sea and for the first time in his life, Charlie didn't feel the weight of his past holding him down. He felt lighter, free, in a way he hadn't imagined possible. Charlie knew that his journey wasn't over. He had a long way to go, but tonight he felt as if he had reached a milestone, a place of acceptance within himself. The world might still see him differently, but he no longer cared. He had learned to love who he was, to embrace his flaws and his strengths. The journey of self-discovery was never easy, but for the first time, Charlie felt that he was finally on the right path. What was is no longer. I am who I am now, Charlie thought to himself as he turned back towards the path leading away from the shore. And whatever this is, it is the result of my own efforts. From now on, I will see myself not through the world's eyes, but through my own. With that, Charlie began to walk away from the shore, his footsteps steady and sure, leaving behind the boy he once was and embracing the man he had become. Charlie was just 13 years old when he sat alone in class, his eyes downcast, his mind adrift in a sea of frustration and confusion. The classroom was full of students, but Charlie felt like he didn't belong. Around him, the other kids were in groups, laughing, talking, playing, while he sat by himself hunched over his notebook. His pencil scratched the paper as he wrote, his handwriting messy but heartfelt. He wasn't writing for anyone's approval, he was writing to release the emotions that had been building inside of him for as long as he could remember. The other kids didn't notice him. They were too busy with their own lives, their own friends. They were too busy living the life that Charlie wished he could have. He watched them from his corner, envy bubbling up inside him. The girls and boys in the other groups had things Charlie could never have. They had friends, they had laughter, and more than anything, they had a place in the world. Charlie often wondered what it was like to be them, to not feel like an outsider all the time, to not constantly wonder why no one ever looked his way or invited him to join in their games or conversations. Why, he asked himself over and over, was he the one left behind? Charlie wasn't a bad kid, he wasn't mean, he wasn't strange, he was just different, and that difference was enough for the other children to reject him. Charlie was a black child in a predominantly white school. He had a different skin color, different hair, and the moment he stepped into the classroom every day, he could feel the coldness in the air. It wasn't something people said outright, but it was something he could sense, the glances, the whispers, the way everyone avoided him. At home, his mother would often tell him not to worry about what others thought. She would say, "Don't let anyone's words define you." But Charlie couldn't help it. Every day the words haunted him. Every insult, every teasing comment about his appearance, it all sank deep into his heart. It was hard to ignore the racism that existed in the world, but it was even harder to ignore it when it came from the people around him, people who were supposed to be his friends. "I'm so tired, Mama. I don't know how much longer I can do this," Charlie would often whisper to himself, looking at his reflection in the mirror. It felt like he was suffocating, like no matter how much he tried to fit in, the world was against him. Why do I have to be different? Why do people treat me like this? Charlie's handwriting trembled on the pages of his notebook. He would write letters to his mother in his thoughts, telling her how lonely he felt, how rejected he was by everyone around him. "Mama, why did you leave me in this world all alone? Why does no one like me here? Everyone likes the pretty kids, the ones who look like everyone else." The words spilled out, his heart heavy with a pain that had been building for years. Charlie didn't understand why it was so difficult for people to accept him, why his skin color seemed to make him invisible to those who were so quick to judge him. He wasn't a bad person, he wasn't a criminal, but to them he was nothing more than an outsider. He had felt the sting of racism from the time he was a small child, and it had only gotten worse as he grew. In the classroom, Charlie kept his head down, trying to focus on his work, but the whispers and stares never stopped. The teachers, too, didn't seem to notice the way the other children treated him. They would praise the other students for their achievements, but Charlie never got any recognition. He could feel their eyes on him, but it was never with admiration. It was with disdain, with suspicion, as if he were some kind of anomaly. The kids at school would often call him names like dirty or poor, making fun of his accent or the color of his skin. They laughed as if it were a joke, but for Charlie, it was the kind of pain that cut deep, something he couldn't erase no matter how hard he tried. God, Charlie wrote in his notebook, the ink blurring as his tears fell onto the page. Why didn't you make me beautiful? Why doesn't anyone like me? No one sees me. No one cares about me. Please, God, make me something that people can love, something that makes me special. Charlie had heard about the concept of prayer. He had been told that if he asked God for something with all his heart, it would come true. So he wrote his letter to God, asking for something that seemed so simple yet so out of reach: acceptance. But it was never that easy. He had learned the hard way that no amount of wishing could change the way people saw him. As he stared at the words in his notebook, Charlie felt defeated. It wasn't just about being popular or having friends. It was about feeling like he had a place in the world, about being able to walk into a room and not feel the weight of everyone's judgment. It was about being seen for who he truly was, not for the color of his skin. Charlie had tried to ignore the hatred, to pretend it didn't affect him, but deep down he knew it did. Every day it wore him down just a little bit more, until he didn't even recognize himself anymore. But even in the darkest moments, Charlie still held on to a sliver of hope. He didn't know where it came from or how it survived in his heart, but it was there. The belief that maybe, just maybe, things could change. Maybe one day the world would see him for who he truly was, a human being with hopes and dreams, with a heart that was capable of love and kindness. One day things will be different, Charlie thought to himself as he closed his notebook. One day I won't have to hide. One day I'll be seen for who I really am. As he left the classroom that day, Charlie knew the journey ahead of him would be long. But he was determined to keep going, to find a way to make people see him, not for his skin, not for his circumstances, but for the person he was inside. Because he believed, deep down, that there was more to him than the world had yet discovered. After the tragic death of Charlie's mother, his father found a new companion, someone who was entirely different from Charlie's mother, both in appearance and background. Charlie's father remarried a woman from a different world, someone who seemed to have little understanding or empathy for his son's past or his struggles. Charlie's new stepmother was a white woman, young and full of ambition, much like the women his father used to admire before. Her presence in their household was a constant reminder of Charlie's place in the world, a place that felt increasingly foreign and uncomfortable to him. Charlie's father had always been a hard-working man. He had provided for his family, and despite the deep pain of losing his first wife, he found a way to move on. But what about Charlie? What about his pain, his loss, and his struggles? Those questions seemed irrelevant to his father now, who was more preoccupied with his new life, his new wife, and his two young stepchildren, two children who were white, just like their mother. The contrast between Charlie's dark skin and the fair skin of his stepmother and half-siblings was stark, and it was impossible for Charlie not to feel like an outsider in his own home. His new stepmother didn't make it any easier. From the moment she entered Charlie's life, it was clear that she didn't see him the way his mother had. Charlie's mother had been his protector, his shield from the cruel words and actions of the world outside. But his stepmother was not like that. She had a different perspective on life, and more importantly, on Charlie's place in it. Charlie's stepmother, while polite at first, soon began to show a more indifferent side to her new role in the family. Charlie had always been a quiet, reserved child, but his new stepmother seemed to find fault with even his silence. She would often speak condescendingly to him, telling him things like, "Why don't you speak up more?" or "You need to be more like your siblings." Charlie felt isolated in his own home. His father, for reasons Charlie couldn't understand, never intervened in these moments. It was as though his father had accepted the way things were, as though his own son was less important than his new wife and her children. There were days when Charlie would sit quietly in his room, away from the noise of his stepmother's laughter and the chatter of his two new half-siblings. He would hear them downstairs, playing together, laughing together, and it made him feel more alone than ever. Charlie's stepmother would often call him down for dinner, but even at the table, it was clear that he didn't belong. His half-siblings, with their pale faces and bright eyes, would laugh and talk about their day, while Charlie would sit quietly, pushing his food around his plate, feeling as though he was invisible. One day, as Charlie sat at the dinner table, his stepmother looked at him and then at his plate. "Why don't you ever eat?" she asked, her voice dripping with irritation. "You're so skinny. You need to eat like your siblings. Why don't you take care of yourself?" Charlie, who had always struggled with self-esteem, felt his heart sink. His stepmother's words stung more than he expected. "I'm not hungry," he mumbled, barely able to look up from his plate. But instead of offering sympathy or understanding, she simply rolled her eyes and muttered under her breath, "You need to stop acting like you're so special, Charlie." Charlie's father, who had been sitting at the table with them, didn't say a word. He just kept eating, his eyes fixed on his plate. Charlie looked at his father, hoping for some kind of intervention, but his father said nothing. The silence between them felt suffocating. The days went by, and Charlie's feelings of isolation grew. He felt as though no one in the house truly cared about him. His stepmother's indifference only deepened his sense of abandonment. When he tried to talk to his father about how he was feeling, his father would just nod, tell him everything would be fine, and change the subject. It was as if his father was no longer invested in understanding Charlie's struggles. His father's new life with his new wife and children had consumed him. One evening, after a particularly harsh conversation with his stepmother, Charlie retreated to his room. He could hear his father and stepmother laughing downstairs, but it felt so distant. It wasn't the laughter of a family. It was the laughter of people who were simply living their own lives without considering the pain that might be lingering in the background. Charlie's thoughts turned dark. He thought about his mother, how she used to protect him from the world. He remembered how she used to tell him that no matter how hard life got, he was special. He wasn't like anyone else, and that made him strong. But those words felt hollow now. His mother was gone, and Charlie felt like he was losing himself too. It wasn't just the way his stepmother treated him that hurt. It was the fact that no one else in the house seemed to notice. Charlie's father, consumed by his new life, was too distracted to see the hurt his son was enduring. Charlie had always been a quiet child, but now he was retreating further into himself. He felt as though he didn't matter to anyone. He wasn't important enough to be heard, and that loneliness weighed on him every day. Charlie's stepmother continued to belittle him in small ways. One evening, when Charlie had gone to bed early, his stepmother made a sarcastic remark to his father about him, loud enough for Charlie to hear through the door. "He's just so difficult," she said. "He's not like the other kids. He's always so quiet, always so withdrawn. I don't know how to deal with him." Charlie felt a knot form in his stomach as he listened. He wanted to shout, to tell her how much she was hurting him, but he knew it wouldn't matter. He knew she didn't care. And his father? He would probably just side with her, as he always did. One day, Charlie couldn't take it anymore. He had spent years enduring his stepmother's cruel words and his father's silence. And something inside him snapped. He confronted his father, his voice shaking with emotion. "Why do you let her treat me like this? Don't you care about me?" he asked, his eyes brimming with tears. His father looked at him, his face expressionless. "She's my wife, Charlie. I love her. She's part of this family now. You need to accept it." Charlie's heart shattered. His father had chosen her over him, just as he had chosen his new family over the one that had once been his. That night, Charlie lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, feeling as though his world had collapsed. He realized then that he couldn't change how things were. His father would never see him the way he needed to be seen. His stepmother, would never accept him. Charlie was alone in a world that didn't care about him, and it was a loneliness he had never felt before. Charlie had always longed for the things that other children seemed to take for granted. He grew up in a world where his desires were constantly overlooked, dismissed, or outright ignored. The things he dreamed of, simple things that could have brought him joy, always felt just out of reach. And as much as he tried to suppress his wishes, they lingered, only intensifying as the years went by. From a young age, Charlie had a particular longing that stayed with him throughout his childhood. He often dreamed of having his own Christmas tree, something that many children had the luxury of decorating in their homes each year. For Charlie, Christmas had always been a distant, almost foreign concept. While other kids would excitedly hang ornaments on their trees, creating a festive atmosphere with their families, Charlie's experience of Christmas was very different. Every year, as the holiday season approached, he would watch as his stepmother and her children decorated their tree, laughing and singing Christmas carols. His father was absent, absorbed in his work, and Charlie, left alone in the background, could only look on wistfully. There was one particular year that stood out in Charlie's memory. He was about 10 years old at the time. He had been saving a small amount of pocket money for months, hoping to buy a tree for himself. He even had an idea of where he wanted to place it, right next to the window, where he could see it from his room every day. He envisioned decorating it with handmade ornaments, just like the other kids in his class, who boasted about their Christmas decorations every year. It would be his own tree, something to call his own. But that year, his hopes were dashed once again. As Christmas drew closer, Charlie's stepmother and her children began their annual tree decorating ritual. Charlie's father, who usually stayed out of the festive preparations, didn't intervene. Instead, he sat in his chair, reading the newspaper or watching television, oblivious to his son's yearning. Charlie, standing in the doorway, watched as his step-siblings joyfully hung ornaments on the tree. They laughed and joked with their mother, who seemed so pleased with the holiday cheer that she never noticed the boy standing in the shadows. Charlie couldn't bear it any longer. He had saved enough money for a small tree, just a little one. But his father, noticing his sadness, simply told him, "You don't need a tree, Charlie. We already have one. Go and help your step-siblings with theirs." Charlie tried to protest, but his father's dismissive tone shut him down instantly. "Don't make a fuss. It's just a tree. You'll be fine." The words stung deeply. It wasn't just about the tree. It was about the fact that Charlie's desires, his simple, innocent wishes, were never taken seriously. They were always brushed aside, as if he didn't matter. His father's lack of empathy for his son's emotional needs was a recurring theme in Charlie's life, and it had slowly begun to take its toll on him. On Christmas Eve that year, Charlie lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling. He could hear the laughter and joy of his step-siblings downstairs, the sound of wrapping paper being torn open and presents exchanged. It was a celebration that Charlie had always longed to be a part of, but it never felt like it was meant for him. He didn't belong in their world. He wasn't part of the family, not really. His stepmother and her children were the ones who mattered. Charlie, the outsider, was left to watch from the sidelines, alone in his room. The following day, when his stepmother asked him to help clean up after the Christmas celebrations, Charlie felt the weight of her words. "You might as well help. There's no reason for you to be left out of everything." The way she said it, as though she were doing him a favor, made Charlie feel even more invisible. It was as if his presence in their house was nothing more than an afterthought, something to be tolerated but never truly appreciated. This pattern of exclusion, where Charlie's wants and needs were ignored, extended far beyond the Christmas tree. Another one of Charlie's unfulfilled desires was for a bicycle. He had longed for one for years. Every time he saw other children riding their bikes in the park, racing down the street, or simply enjoying the freedom of a two-wheeled ride, Charlie's heart would ache with envy. He had imagined countless times how it would feel to ride a bike of his own, how it would give him a sense of independence, a sense of belonging in the world. But that dream, too, remained out of reach. Charlie's father was a man who had always provided for his family, but his idea of provision didn't include fulfilling his son's emotional needs or material desires. Charlie had asked his father for a bicycle many times, but his requests were always met with cold indifference or dismissive remarks. His father's excuse was always the same. "We don't have the money for that, Charlie. A bicycle is a luxury." Charlie didn't understand. He had seen the way his father spent money on his new wife and her children. He had seen the way they would receive the latest toys, new clothes, and extravagant gifts. But Charlie, the child who had been with his father since the beginning, was never granted the same privileges. He was always told that they didn't have the money, that it was too expensive, that he should learn to be content with what he had. One day, when Charlie was about 12 years old, he couldn't hold back his frustration any longer. He asked his father again, his voice trembling with emotion, "Why can't I have a bicycle, Dad? Why is it so hard for you to get me one?" His father, who was busy reading the newspaper at the time, didn't look up. "Because we don't have the money, Charlie. Maybe if you didn't waste it on silly things, you could get your own." Charlie's heart sank. He had never asked for anything extravagant. Just simple things that other kids had. But his father's harsh words stung like a slap in the face. Charlie felt his dreams crumble in that moment. His father didn't care about his wishes. He didn't care about his son's happiness. All he cared about was providing for his new family, keeping them happy, and making sure they had everything they wanted. Charlie's desires were nothing but a burden to him. It wasn't just the Christmas tree or the bicycle that Charlie had been denied. It was everything. Charlie had always felt like he was invisible in his own home, always second to his stepmother and her children. His father's lack of empathy, his refusal to see Charlie's pain, made him feel as though he was nothing more than an afterthought. And with every passing year, Charlie's longing for the simple things in life grew stronger, while his sense of self-worth continued to diminish. As he grew older, Charlie became more and more aware of the disparity between his life and the lives of those around him. He saw how other children had everything they wanted, while he was left yearning for the things that seemed to come so easily to others. And with each passing day, he felt the weight of his unfulfilled dreams, the weight of his father's neglect, and the weight of the loneliness that had been his constant companion throughout his childhood. Charlie had always hoped that one day things would change, that his father would see him, really see him, and understand his pain. But deep down, Charlie knew that he was still the invisible boy, the one whose dreams would always be left unfulfilled. Charlie's entire year was shaped by a single goal, a dream that seemed so simple, yet was so far out of his reach. What he wanted most wasn't a toy, a game, or even something that would bring him immediate pleasure. No, Charlie's dream was a Christmas tree. For as long as he could remember, he had wanted a tree of his own, something to light up his room, something that would make Christmas feel a little more like the way he imagined it should be. But there was one problem. Charlie's family couldn't afford a Christmas tree, not one like the kids in school had anyway. His father, despite working long hours, never had enough money to buy something so extravagant. Meanwhile, his stepmother and her children, who were always given what they wanted, would decorate their house with an enormous tree every year. Charlie's heart ached when he saw how simple his life seemed in comparison. His own room, devoid of any Christmas cheer, felt so empty. This year, Charlie made up his mind that he would change that. He didn't want a tree just to follow a tradition. For him, the Christmas tree represented something much deeper, something that would prove he wasn't invisible, something that would let him feel just a little bit more normal in a world that often made him feel like an outsider. So Charlie devised a plan. He knew that if he was going to have his own Christmas tree, he needed money. But there was one problem. Charlie's pocket money was meager, just a few coins here and there, barely enough to buy anything at all. However, Charlie wasn't the type to give up easily. Every week when he received his small allowance, he resisted the urge to buy the things that other kids seemed to enjoy so easily: chocolates, chips, toys. Charlie had learned a valuable lesson in restraint. His friends would eagerly rush to the store, spending their small amounts of pocket money on snacks or treats. Charlie, however, would silently walk past the shop window, hands stuffed into his pockets, forcing himself to look away from the brightly colored bags of chips and the tempting displays of candy. "Not now," he would remind himself. "Not for this. I'm saving for something important." Every single coin Charlie received, he would place carefully into his money box at home. It wasn't a lot, but he knew that small efforts would eventually add up. Each coin was a tiny step toward his goal, and the small, everyday sacrifices made the prize at the end seem more worth it. He didn't need toys. He didn't need anything else. His mind was set, and every moment he resisted the temptation to spend on anything frivolous felt like a victory. Over the months, Charlie's little money box grew heavier, but the work wasn't easy. The hardest part wasn't saving the money. It was the constant reminder that he was doing something that no one else seemed to understand. His friends would share their treats with him, offering him a chocolate bar here or a bag of chips there. It would have been so easy to take one. But Charlie couldn't afford to lose sight of his goal, and so he would politely refuse. "No, thanks," he would say, though inside he longed to be part of the normal moments his friends were having. One particular day stood out in Charlie's mind. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon, and a group of his classmates were sitting in the park, surrounded by the usual assortment of snacks. As Charlie walked past them, one of his friends, Mark, called out, "Hey, Charlie, you want some chips?" he asked, holding up a large bag. Charlie hesitated for a moment. The bag of chips was large and shiny, and it smelled delicious. He could almost taste the salt on his lips, feel the crunch as he bit into them. But then he thought about the Christmas tree he was working so hard for. One simple bag of chips could ruin all his progress, and he couldn't afford that. With a smile, he shook his head. "Thanks, Mark, but I'm good," he said. Mark just shrugged and went back to his snack. Charlie walked away, the emptiness in his stomach momentarily forgotten in the satisfaction of his decision. At the end of each week, Charlie would sit in his room and count his savings. There weren't many coins, but the sight of them in his little box gave him hope. He would touch them gently, as if they were something sacred. These coins weren't just money, they were the key to his dream. Every time he counted them, he could feel his heart beat faster in anticipation. His goal was within reach. His stepmother and her children, meanwhile, would decorate their house with extravagant Christmas trees every year. Charlie couldn't help but feel the sharp sting of jealousy when he saw the gleaming lights and colorful ornaments in their living room. He would often sneak into their house, watching from the doorway as they laughed and hung up decorations. It wasn't that he hated them for it. It was just the feeling of being left out, of knowing that he could never have the same things. But Charlie didn't let that feeling define him. He had his eyes set on something more meaningful, a tree of his own, something that would make him feel special, something that would make him feel worthy. The months passed, and soon it was Christmas Eve. Charlie's money box was filled with coins, and his heart was filled with hope. Tomorrow he would be able to buy his very own Christmas tree. His excitement was palpable. He couldn't sleep, tossing and turning in bed as he imagined what it would feel like to stand in front of a tree that was all his. The lights twinkling, the smell of pine in the air, the feeling of something beautiful and normal in a world that hadn't always been kind to him. Charlie's hands trembled slightly as he opened the money box, counting the coins one last time. It was enough. He had enough for the tree. That night, Charlie hardly slept. All he could think about was the tree. In his mind, he was already decorating it, hanging simple homemade ornaments on the branches, imagining how beautiful it would look. The tree was his. It was a symbol of everything he had worked for. The next morning, Charlie went to the store early, clutching his coins tightly in his hand. He was nervous, but he knew this was the moment. This was his Christmas miracle. When he bought the tree, it was small and simple, but to Charlie, it was perfect. It was the culmination of all his hard work and sacrifice, the thing that had kept him going all year. Charlie took the tree home, and for the first time his room felt different. It felt like Christmas. It felt like home. On Christmas Day, Charlie carefully decorated his small Christmas tree with all the love and attention he could muster. It was not much compared to the large, beautiful tree his siblings had in their house, but to Charlie, it was everything. His siblings' tree was grand, adorned with shiny ornaments and sparkling lights. It was everything Charlie wished for, but it was out of his reach. Their tree had been put up with the help of their parents, who spared no expense in making it perfect. Charlie couldn't help but feel the pang of jealousy when he looked at it. Their tree was the symbol of everything that came easily to them: money, love, happiness. In contrast, Charlie's tree was small. It was a simple pine, and its decorations were homemade, just a few colorful papers, some strings of beads, and a few ornaments he'd made himself. But for Charlie, it was far more than just a decoration. It was the product of his hard work, of his sacrifice throughout the entire year. Every coin he had saved, every moment he had resisted the temptation to spend, had led to this tree. The joy he felt while decorating it was indescribable. As he carefully placed each ornament, his heart swelled with pride. His tree may not have been the grandest, but it was his, and that made all the difference. This tree, his Christmas tree, was a reminder of what he had worked for and the sacrifices he had made. It wasn't just about the tree itself, it was about the journey it represented. Every single coin, every moment of self-discipline had led to this small but significant victory. Charlie couldn't help but smile as he stepped back and admired his work. The twinkling lights on his little tree illuminated his face as he gazed at it. For the first time, he felt like he was a part of something magical. His tree was his gift to himself, a symbol of his resilience and determination. However, not everyone shared Charlie's sense of pride and joy. That afternoon, some guests came over to Charlie's house. They were friends of his stepmother, and their arrival was not welcomed by Charlie. These guests didn't know Charlie's struggles, nor did they understand the meaning behind his humble Christmas tree. All they saw was something that was lacking, something that didn't measure up to their standards. As the guests sat down and exchanged pleasantries with Charlie's father and stepmother, Charlie couldn't help but overhear their conversation. One of them, a woman in her early 30s, looked at Charlie's tree and smiled, though it wasn't a kind smile. "Is this all you could manage for Christmas, Charlie?" she asked, her voice dripping with mockery. Charlie looked down at the ground, unable to meet her gaze. He had spent so much time and energy on that tree, yet here it was, being belittled in front of him. The woman continued, "It's cute, I guess, but it's so small compared to what your siblings have. Don't you feel a little embarrassed by it?" Her words felt like daggers, each one piercing Charlie's heart. He had poured everything he had into making this Christmas special, and yet, in the eyes of others, it was still not enough. His tree was small, yes, but it had meaning. It had a story behind it. But to these people, it was just another symbol of what he lacked. Charlie's stepmother, who was sitting nearby, did nothing to defend him. Instead, she just smiled and nodded, as if agreeing with their cruel comments. Charlie's heart sank. Why didn't anyone understand? Why was it so hard for them to see that this was the one thing he had worked so hard for, the one thing he had managed to make his own? It felt like no matter what he did, it was never enough to earn their respect, their love, or their kindness. Feeling a wave of sadness and humiliation wash over him, Charlie couldn't bear to stay in the room any longer. He quietly excused himself and ran outside, away from the prying eyes and harsh words. His chest tightened as he made his way to the back of the house, to the small patch of snow-covered ground where he often went when he needed to escape. There, amidst the quiet beauty of the snow, Charlie let the tears fall. He sat down on a snowbank, his body trembling as the cold seeped through his clothes. His small Christmas tree was still inside, but it felt so far away now. The joy he had felt earlier was now replaced with a deep, aching sadness. Charlie wondered if he would ever be good enough, if he would ever truly belong. His heart ached with the realization that, no matter how hard he tried, he would always feel like an outsider in his own home. The snowflakes continued to fall softly around him, and Charlie's thoughts began to swirl in the quiet, icy air. He couldn't stop the tears from flowing. It wasn't just the mockery of his tree that hurt. It was the sense of rejection, of not being enough. It was the constant reminder that in this world there were people who were always going to have more, always going to be more, and he would always be left wanting. As the hours passed, Charlie didn't move. He stayed there in the snow, alone with his thoughts and his pain. His Christmas had been overshadowed by the harsh words of others, and he wasn't sure how to escape the feeling of inadequacy that had settled in his chest. He had worked so hard for this moment, and yet it felt like it had all been in vain. But as he sat there, shivering in the cold, Charlie realized something. Maybe he would never be able to please everyone. Maybe he would never be able to fit into the mold that society expected of him. But that didn't mean he wasn't worthy. His tree, his efforts, his dreams, they all meant something. No one could take that away from him. And even if he wasn't celebrated or acknowledged by the people around him, he knew that he had done something that was truly his. It wasn't about their approval. It was about his own sense of accomplishment. For the first time that day, Charlie felt a flicker of warmth in his heart. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him that his worth didn't depend on the opinions of others. His journey was his own, and it was far from over. He had a long way to go, but he knew that he could keep going, even when the world seemed to turn its back on him. Because in the end, he was enough. As Charlie finally stood up, brushing the snow off his pants, he felt a renewed sense of strength. He had been knocked down, yes, but he was still standing. He might have been alone in that moment, but he was not defeated. He would keep moving forward one step at a time. And next year, maybe, just maybe, his tree would be even bigger. Charlie returned home late that night, his eyes swollen and his heart heavy with the sadness of the day. His steps were slow, weighed down by the humiliation and loneliness he had experienced earlier. His Christmas had been ruined, overshadowed by the harsh words and judgmental glances of those who couldn't understand his struggles. He had tried so hard, put so much effort into making his Christmas tree and his small world shine, but in the end, it had all felt like it wasn't enough. As he lay down in bed, Charlie couldn't stop the tears from falling. He buried his face in his pillow, trying to muffle the sobs that racked his body. The words of the guests, the laughter at his expense, echoed in his mind. He felt like he was trapped in a world where he would never be able to escape the judgment of others. But as he cried, something inside him broke. In his brokenness, he whispered the one wish that had been gnawing at him for years. "Santa Claus," he whispered through his sobs, "please make me white. I just want to be white. That's all I want for Christmas. Please make me just like them. Please make me beautiful. Make me accepted. I want to be like them so badly." It wasn't the first time Charlie had thought about this. It wasn't the first time he had wished to be different, to be what society seemed to value. But tonight the pain felt unbearable. His heart ached for acceptance, for love, for the chance to be something more than the outsider he had always been. His voice cracked as he spoke, his wish a desperate plea for a change that he thought was impossible. With his eyes closed, he drifted into an exhausted sleep, unaware of the miracle that was about to unfold. The next morning, Charlie woke up feeling a strange heaviness in his chest. It wasn't the weight of sadness anymore, but something else, something he couldn't quite understand. His eyes fluttered open, but the world seemed blurry. He felt drained from the emotional exhaustion of the previous night's tears. Rubbing his eyes, he sluggishly sat up, trying to shake off the fog of sleep. His body ached, and he could still feel the emotional scars of yesterday. But something felt different. Charlie groggily made his way to the bathroom to freshen up. His mind was still half-dazed, struggling to process everything that had happened. As he stepped into the bathroom and looked at his reflection in the mirror, he froze. His heart skipped a beat. He couldn't believe his eyes. There, staring back at him, was a version of himself that he didn't recognize. Charlie blinked, rubbed his eyes again, and then stared harder, unable to process what he was seeing. His reflection had changed. He looked white. His skin, which had always been a deep, rich brown, was now a fair shade of white. Charlie's breath caught in his throat as he touched his face, feeling the smoothness of his skin. His dark features were now replaced by a lighter complexion, and his hair, which had once been curly and black, now appeared straight and blonde. It was as if the wish he had whispered so desperately had been granted. Charlie's mind raced. Was this real? Had Santa Claus really heard his wish and made it come true? He felt a strange sense of disbelief. This couldn't be happening. He had only wished for this in the quietest moments of his heart, never expecting anything to actually change. But here he was, staring at a face that seemed foreign to him, a face that was no longer his own. For a moment, Charlie simply stood there, dumbfounded. The world around him felt unreal. How could this be possible? Was he dreaming? He pinched his arm to make sure it wasn't some strange illusion, but the pain confirmed that this was no dream. His hands trembled as he continued to stare at the reflection. There was no going back. This was his new reality. As the shock began to wear off, Charlie stepped back from the mirror. He felt a mixture of awe and confusion. For so long, he had wished for this moment. He had longed for a chance to be like the others, to be accepted, to escape the constant weight of racism that had defined his life. And now, it seemed, his wish had been granted. But deep down, a small voice inside him asked, "Was this really what you wanted? Is this who you really are?" The questions swirled in his mind, but before he could process them further, Charlie heard voices from downstairs. His father, his stepmother, and his step-siblings were all awake, talking and laughing. Charlie felt a wave of nervousness wash over him. He wasn't sure how they would react to his new appearance. Would they see him as the same person? Would they accept him now that he looked like them? He stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. Part of him wanted to go downstairs and confront them, to see their reactions, but another part of him wanted to retreat, to hide away from the world that had always made him feel different. But in the end, he once consumed him began to fade, replaced by a sense of belonging that was both thrilling and overwhelming. But as much as Charlie relished the newfound attention, something inside him still felt uneasy. The transformation was physical, yes, but the journey within towards self-acceptance and understanding hadn't been completed. The life that he now led, full of praise and admiration, seemed to come with its own set of complications. Charlie began to question whether the people around him truly saw him for who he was, or if they only saw the version of him that they wanted to see, the one who was now beautiful and accepted. When Charlie turned 18, he decided it was time to return to the place that had always been a source of comfort for him, and yet a place that he had avoided for years. The grave of his mother. He had always thought about her, especially after the change had happened. Charlie felt like he owed her an explanation, a confession. She had been the one who had always loved him, always protected him from the cruel realities of the world. She had been the one to shield him from the racism that had been a constant shadow in his life. She had fought for him, despite the hatred and prejudice she herself faced. So Charlie found himself standing at her grave one cold afternoon. He stared at the headstone, the name of his mother engraved in stone. and felt an overwhelming rush of emotions. The tears that had been building up in him for so long finally flowed freely. He sank to his knees in front of the grave, the weight of everything he had experienced pressing down on him. "Mom," he whispered, choking on his words. "I don't know why this happened. I don't understand why I'm different now, why I look the way I do. I just wanted to be like everyone else. I wanted to fit in. I wanted to be accepted." He paused, the wind blowing softly around him, carrying the scent of earth and flowers. Charlie closed his eyes and remembered all the moments of his childhood when his mother had been there to comfort him. She had taught him to be strong, to hold his head high even in the face of racism and hatred. But now, as an adult, Charlie was struggling with a different kind of pain. He had wished so hard for change, and now that it had come, he wasn't sure if it had been worth it. "I know you went through the same things, Mom," Charlie continued, his voice soft. "You were always so strong. But I see now. You were a Negro, too. You had to endure everything I did, just like I did. But you were always there for me, always protecting me, even when things got hard." A wave of sorrow washed over him as he realized the sacrifice his mother had made for him. She had never had the luxury of changing her appearance or escaping her identity. She had been born with the skin that society had deemed inferior, and yet she had fought against it every day of her life. Charlie wondered if she would have ever wanted to change if she could have. Would she have asked for the same thing he had? Acceptance, love, and the privilege of fitting into a world that had constantly rejected them? Charlie looked up at the sky, tears still falling down his face. "I don't know what to do anymore, Mom. I look like them now. I'm what they wanted me to be, but I don't feel like I'm any different. I'm still me, the same person I've always been. I don't know if they truly see me. I don't know if they'll ever really understand me." He stood up slowly, wiping the tears from his cheeks. "But I promise you, I'll keep going. I'll live the life you wanted for me. I'll make you proud. I'll find my own way, even if I don't know what that way is yet." With those words, Charlie took a deep breath and left the grave, his heart heavy, but his resolve stronger than ever. He knew that the path ahead wouldn't be easy. The world would continue to judge him based on his appearance, and the struggle for true acceptance would continue. But now Charlie understood that the most important thing wasn't changing to fit into the world. It was learning to accept himself as he was, with all his flaws, his pain, and his beauty. Charlie's story was one of transformation, not just on the outside, but also on the inside. It was about coming to terms with the painful realities of life and finding peace with oneself, regardless of what the world thought. It was a reminder that change might not always be what we expect or want, but it can lead to unexpected lessons about who we truly are and what we truly need to be happy.